Thank you very much. As you may hear, you may have to forgive my voice. It's courtesy of Air Canada. My lung capacity is still somewhere over the North Atlantic, so I do apologise for my slightly croaky sound, and if my voice gives out completely, we may have to resort to mime halfway through. Because we are surrounded by the project, in what I'm going to say now, I'm not actually going to talk too much about the nuts and bolts of the project as it's evolving. Perhaps that's something we can discuss afterwards. What I propose to do is talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we can open things up to questions people may have. Just a word on my status before I start. Goldin+Senneby declared that I was their spokesperson. I redubbed myself yesterday. I'm now their emissary. And the reason for doing that is simply it's more accurate. I don't speak on their behalf. I speak on my behalf in their stead. And they're quite happy about this. I met them for the first time yesterday and explained this to them, and they backed off quite readily, so presumably it's okay. What I'm going to talk about is, as you can see on the screen, ripping a title off Max Ernst from the 1920s, Les Artistes sans têtes. I don't know if many people are familiar with La Femme sans tête, which was Ernst's extraordinary collage collection, hundreds of pages of the most extraordinary surrealist collages. It seemed appropriate partly because of Ernst's association with Bataille in the 20s, but also because of the way it translates. It's translated into English beautifully as the 100 Headless Woman. So perhaps we can translate this as the 100 Headless Artists, which seems to say something about the complexity of the project as it unfolds, which you can see on the back wall of the room next door. In doing so, I want to address three particular issues, one of which is quite general and has been referred to by Greg in his introduction, which is the multitextual, multi-authored nature of the project, hence multitext. But I also want to speak specifically to the ideas of Xenomoney and Xenospace. Just to explain what that means, Xeno means outside or other. Money of the outside, space of the outside, artifacts of exteriority. And I'll come on to explain what I mean by that in due course. Now, were my students here, they would groan because I'm notorious for putting long quotes on screens and then reading them out and making you understand them. So my apologies, you can groan too if you like, but I'm still going to do it. This is a quote from Jean-Joseph Gueux, and the reason I chose this quote is because Gueux is the next generation after Bataille, if you like. Gueux is writing this in 1970 in Paris, 2 years after the failed student uprisings in Paris, and is reflecting partly on the nature of economy, but specifically on the nature of a political project after, and the subtitle to the book is, After Marx, Freud. And there was a huge re-engagement with a post-Marxist or post-Marx analysis of the economy and a psychoanalytic post-Freud analysis of the economy around this time. The other primary statement is, if people know it, Jean-François Lyotard's libidinal economy. But Gueux, in this quote, sums up a number of aspects, both of Headless as a project, but also of offshore as a practice. And I'll just read the quote and then I'll unpick it a bit. What we are exploring in its limited practice is a non-phallocentric, non-centralized conception, as yet unconceived, of a network, a polynodal, non-representative organization, a conception of the text, a text without title, chapter, heading, or capital. Bataille generalizes that the possibilities of human existence can, as of now, be located beyond the formation of monocephalous societies. And monocephalous in this context means sovereign societies, quite importantly, as we'll come on to discuss. Therefore, in theory, beyond the principle of centralization and not hunkering within its limits, as does every anarchist or confederalist regression. The very thought of the general equivalent, and I'll come back to that, he means money here, would have to be decapitated to pave the way for a polymorphic, acephalous social organization that would challenge monopolies on representation. Now, the first section of that is effectively a description of Headless as a project. non-phallocentric I won't go into, it's very much part of the Freudian analysis, but the non-centralized conception and the essence of text, the unfolding text, the multiplicity of text that goes into a project like Headless, a text without title, chapter heading or capital. But Gu is also engaging with Bataille. He's also critiquing Bataille, or at least raising a question. Because Bataille is positing the notion of an emancipatory secret society. That's what Acéphale, this is a journal here, was supposed to be. The whole point of headlessness was to be an emancipatory organization that was secret and hidden. And that true emancipation was the non-centralized, the dispersed, the secret and the concealed, a sort of non-essentialist political organization. Gu raises an important question though, because he argues here, and this is primarily a book about money. Gu is a very important monetary theorist in a psychoanalytic sense, in that he argues that money itself would have to be decapitated. And he's suggesting that money itself, the general equivalent, is that which would have to be decapitated in order for this secret society to emerge. Now what I want to do in the course of this is to, and I'll come back to Gu at the end, is to suggest that, well, in a sense that did happen, but not in the way we expected, and certainly not in the way Bataille expected. Because in a sense we have developed a secret society. There's nothing to do with what Bataille set up in Acéphale. Whether or not it remains with us as Headless Limited remains to be seen. I leave that bit to Goldin+Senneby. But in a sense, the secrecy that Bataille wanted and that Gu is questioning is still with us, but with a result that has been far from emancipatory in general. Now, before I do that, I want to turn first to the idea of the multitext. And picking up on what Greg said in his introduction, Goldin+Senneby are by no means the first multiple artist, nor are they the first dispersed writers of text. But I want to go right back. And the reason I want to do that is partly just to, partly a bit of fun, I happen to like this, but also because the example I want to use raises some important parallels with what Goldin+Senneby are doing, but more importantly with what offshore does in terms of constructing particular spaces of economic practice. The other reason I want to go so far back, this is to 1367, is because the construction of outsides is something that is actually very central to Western capitalist societies for many hundreds of years. And the fact that it articulates itself in these very complex multi-texts is also rather important. Anyway, this image, I don't think this image itself is from 1367, that I've labelled Goldin+Senneby Mark I, is an image of Sir John Mandeville. I don't know if people know the travels of Sir John Mandeville. In 1367, a book appeared called The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, which told the tale of an English knight of St. Albans. It was written in French, and it told the story of 30 years of travel. And in the course of the book, Mandeville travels, presumably from St. Albans in England, to Jerusalem, which at the time was the centre of the world. I don't know how many people are familiar with the medieval TO map, the circle with a T inscribed in it. Jerusalem was at the centre. And from that, Mandeville then travels further, both geographically, but also conceptually, because the lands that Mandeville travels to in the course of his voyage become more fantastic the further he gets away. So he travels, for example, to the land of Prester John. Prester John was a mythical priest king, a Christian priest king who lived somewhere in the east. No one was quite sure where, but it was very important that Mandeville travel to that place. He actually gets to the edge of paradise. Doesn't actually get to paradise, he gets stuck in the land of Prester John. The importance of this is that Mandeville's travels were fictional. They did not exist. Mandeville himself did not exist, as far as we know. In fact, the travels of John Mandeville are compiled from about 27 plus different sources. And they were then written out in a number of different versions over many years. So by 1450, for example, and remember this is pre-printing press, pre-Gutenberg, pre-satellite, there were translations into 8 different languages, including Irish and Czech. We have 300 copies of this remaining. It's an incredibly important account of the world. And it remains so for hundreds of years. This image is by the Dutch cartographer Ortelius. I don't know how clear it is on the screen. If you can't see it, the panel, the square panel, says that this is a map of the land of Prester John. This is about 250 years after Mandeville's text came out. And it's important for me here is that this is a fairly accurate topographical map of North Africa, onto which has been imposed a completely mythical domain. Prester John never existed. When Western adventurers finally encountered Genghis Khan, they thought they had encountered Prester John right up until they got killed. But Prester John himself was purely mythical, but was a very important geographical fact. Mandeville was regarded for hundreds of years as a geographer, as a real geographer, someone who had really travelled and presented a real world. In 1499, when Leonardo da Vinci's library was catalogued, there was Mandeville, pride of place on the shelf as a travelogue. Marco Polo allegedly took Mandeville's book with him when he went east. And Mandeville's text is, in a sense, one of the early versions of what becomes the Orientalism made famous by Edward Said. It's an account of another place. For it is not like over here. It's an extract from the text. And that's very, very significant, because what Mandeville is doing is not describing a journey to, he's describing our distance from. He's creating a space of exteriority against which he measures our faults. His is a moral geography, a cosmography, a very complex combination of topography and religion and myth and all the rest of it. And that is partly why it becomes so important. Now, the reason I wanted to highlight that was because the mythical space of offshore has been with us since the 1950s, quite possibly. And we believe in it implicitly. And that's partly because we are very credible when it comes to spatiality. We believe this was real for hundreds of years. So we perhaps shouldn't be surprised that the weirdness of offshore, which Headless is exploring, is quite surprising. Now, the other reason for putting Mandeville in is simply because of the presence of headlessness. This creature up here is a blemmy. We've ever come across them. And it's one of a number of monsters that Mandeville encounters on his travels. The further he goes east, the more monsters he finds. And they're not all bad monsters. Blemmy are actually quite nice monsters. And the role of the monsters in the book is quite interesting. Some of them are sexually deviant. Some of them are highly promiscuous. Some of them have very prominent genitals. These ones are headless. A lot of them have funny things with their heads. There are dog heads. There are apple sniffers, my personal favourites, who have to sniff apples. That is their sustenance, and if they lose the scent of the apple, they die. But the monsters are there to provide various moral messages about bestiality, about the good life, and so on. And again, they are over there. They are different from here, and it's that construction of exteriority. Now, this is an immensely complex text. It's a very short text. Depending on which version you read, there are many different versions. But I just wanted to read this particular quote from Ian Higgins, who's written this wonderful book about Mandeville called Writing East, because again it seems to talk to a lot of the same themes that emerge in Headless, or are emerging in Headless, I should say. The book, that is Mandeville's book, is a product of a considered, engaged, and sometimes inspired overwriting of its sources that offers readers an often compelling account of matters pious and profane, historical and scientific, mundane and marvellous. Every text, after all, and especially one as omnivorous as the book, I love that idea of the omnivorous book, and if you go and look at that extraordinary map on the wall through their mapping Headless, that is an omnivorous text if ever I've seen one. represents a kind of field where asynchronous or contradictory cultural forces and elements manifest themselves, and where critical analysis will detect a mixture of the residual, dominant, and emergent elements of a given cultural formation. Not only does this speak to the multitextual nature of Mandeville and indeed of Headless, it also speaks, for me, to the multitextual nature of offshore. Because offshore is a very peculiar thing. It's often treated, particularly by those who enjoy its fruits, as a distinct space, as an institution, as a place. It's entirely legible. In fact, it's not. It's very illegible. Or it's legible in particular ways. It is written in particular ways for particular purposes. And I want to turn to that now because of what happened to, going back to Gu's quote at the beginning, that general equivalent. What happened to money? And why money has become so important in constructing this new space of exteriority, which we call offshore. Now, there are parallels with Mandeville and other multitexts, constructions of outsides. You can find them throughout Western history and offshore. But something different has happened with the offshore economy, which we've never had before. It's one thing to be able to map Prester John on a fictional map and to gauge your moral virtues against it. It's quite another to go there. You couldn't go to Prester John's land. You can sort of go to offshore. Well, you can't, I can't, but your money can. And it can only do so because of a redefinition of money itself. Now, I'm not going to get too involved in the definition of money. It's an extraordinarily complex subject. In the 19th century, it was known as the lethal subject, I suspect, because once you get too far involved in it, you go mad. But this is a quote from an extraordinary book by Brian Rotman, which is actually about the invention of zero, called Signifying Nothing, a fantastic book, where he describes, in very simple terms, the significant change that takes place in the nature of money around about the 1950s. And here it is Rotman who coined this word Xenomoney. For euro and dollars, one should write Xeno and money, respectively. The euro-dollar has long since shed its attachment to Europe. It is in fact no longer geographically located, but circulates within an electronic global market, which, though it's still called the euro-dollar market, is now the international capital market. Indeed, we would now call it the global capital market. This dislocation of money from normal space, or from familiar space, takes place almost by accident in 1957. Faced with a liquidity crisis in the world economy, which is hindering reconstruction in post-war Europe, the Bank of England, prompted by some of its more enthusiastic advisors, allows US dollars to be traded in London banks without reference to the Federal Reserve Board. Now, because of a peculiarity of English law, what no longer happens in the US system doesn't become British or English or even London. Because it's no longer considered to be regulated by the US, because it's outside of the reach of the FRB, it goes nowhere. It simply vanishes. It doesn't go in the ledgers and so on, but it leaves regulatory space. Money actually escapes. Now, a number of people, a number of colleagues of mine have spent a lot of time actually trying to figure out what was the actual decision that allowed this to happen, and nobody quite knows. One or two names come prominently or repeatedly, but there is no single decision that allowed this to happen. What we now call the offshore market, Eurodollar markets, the Eurobond markets, and many other derivatives and financial weirdnesses, the gods and monsters of the offshore, like the gods and monsters of Mandeville's world, were unleashed by this decision in 1957. And that's very important because of a particular feature of money. Money is really peculiar stuff. The closer you look at it, the odder it gets. It is very, very strange. If you want to, I don't know if people know this particular literature, but Georg Simmel's The Philosophy of Money, written in 1900, is a 600-page headache, which I can recommend. It's absolutely phenomenal. But I just wanted to encapsulate some of the extraordinary qualities of money, and this is a quote I use quite a lot from him. And it explains perhaps what is different about the exterior space created by money? Just to read the quote. The ability to construct symbolic objects attains its greatest triumph in money. Money is the adequate expression of the relationship of man to the world, which can only be grasped in single and concrete instances. It is only really conceived when the singular becomes the embodiment of the living mental process, which interweaves all singularities and in this fashion creates reality. Now what Simmel is saying there, and it's a highly condensed version of his argument, relates to the symbolic nature of money. This stuff, which we normally think of as money, isn't money. It's a piece of paper. Intrinsically, it's of no greater value than this piece of paper, except that if you try and take this piece of paper off me, you can have it, and if you try and take this piece of paper off me, I'll fight you for it. And the reason for that is very simple. This is a legally sanctioned symbol. It is not the real thing. It is a representation of money, and money itself has no reality, and hasn't had for 500 and odd years. Really, virtual money emerges in the 1450s with the development of particularly double-entry bookkeeping. So we carry these things around, and they're very sculptural, they're very pretty, very tactile. You've got coins in your pocket that look like gold, silver, and copper, or bronze, but they're not made of gold, silver, or copper. I hate to disappoint you. They're intrinsically worthless. Their value comes entirely from the legal constraints that surround them. They are legal fictions. They are texts, multitexts in many ways. Money is the general equivalent, to go back to Gu's quote at the beginning, however, has a particular importance as a text, as a multitext, because it creates reality. Most of our social realities, certainly all our economic realities, are built around these symbols. It's very peculiar to look at the heart of Western society and Western economy and find nothing but bits of paper. It's a very peculiar construction of value that we place so much importance on these things. But it's that capacity of money to create reality, its protean nature, that makes it so important when it comes to offshore. Because Xenomoney creates a space for itself, a reality for itself, which I'll call Xenospace. Before I do, however, the image at the top here, and maybe the next few slides also have similar images, are lifted directly from the Sovereign Trust website. And the thing you need to know about them is I didn't crop them, okay? And you'll notice a certain theme emerge as they appear, which suggests to me that Sovereign Trust are somehow in league with Headless, because they're all very much. They do have images with heads on too, but I selected the ones that didn't, just to make the point. So to Xenospace, a space of exteriority, space of the outside. This is the Sovereign Trust's website. I don't know how distinct it is. The important one, for my purposes, is the third one along, which, if you could see it, would read sovereign jurisdictions. And the analogy, in a sense, is to Ortelius' map of Prester John, because Ortelius' map of Prester John purported to be a real topographical image of real space. So does this. This claims to be a map of the world, a map of sovereign jurisdictions. But actually, it's a very contradictory map. All maps are contradictory, all maps are lies, but this one is a real stinker. This is a big lie. What you see, I don't know how distinct they are little dots, which are the sovereign jurisdictions in which Sovereign Trust operates, where it has its offices. So if you want to create an offshore company, you go to Sovereign Trust and you can locate your company in any one of these dots. Seems a very legible map, seems a very acceptable map. But actually it's the very opposite of a map, because what this is a map of are exit points. Using this map, or using Sovereign Trust's access to these spaces, they actually completely traduce the purpose of the map. These sovereign spaces are spaces which Sovereign Trust uses the principles of sovereignty to completely undermine and deny sovereignty. There's a very tricky text going on in a map like this, Because the one thing you won't find in any of these sovereign spaces is the money belonging to the people incorporated in those sovereign spaces. That money is virtual. It does not exist. It certainly doesn't exist in these places. But I also put up this quote from Sovereign Group, Sovereign Trust, same thing. And I put it up because of the blandness of the language in which they couch this actually quite extraordinary spatiality. It's all very normal and boring. Here they're describing the use of hybrid company structures, networks of shell companies to hide various types of income. Anti-avoidance legislation may be ineffective in taxing profits rolled up within a hybrid structure. You roll up your profits in a hybrid structure, essentially like rolling up in a carpet so it can't be seen. Generally, there will be no reporting requirements for guarantee members, that's the anonymous people that own offshore companies, in such a structure, so unwanted attention from onshore revenue authorities can be avoided. What offshore does in this kind of way is raise this very peculiar topographical image. Offshore, onshore. Again, it seems very legible. You know, we know that tax havens are in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. Offshore, onshore, makes sense. But actually they're not. Or rather they are, that's some of them. But the biggest offshore centre on the planet is the City of London, which last time I looked was very much onshore. Okay. Global warming and rising tides, it may not be for much longer, but it certainly was last time I looked. Similarly, Hong Kong, New York, and so on. The majority of the world's offshore centres are not islands offshore. So this offshore-onshore topology is a myth. It's a narrative. It's another multitext. It's telling you little stories about where spaces are and where they are not, and it's creating an exteriority. It's creating a space beyond that is not like over here. And in the language, you also get this idea of difference, the different space where unwanted attention from onshore revenue authorities can be avoided. Now, this brings me to a quite tricky concept in many ways. It's a very old concept, which is the state of exception. Because what the likes of sovereign trust, and here the more I look at this, the more I think their name is actually a very deliberate and very smug pun, is deploy a very particular aspect of sovereignty, which is the capacity to define the state of exception, to define the border, not just the physical border, the moral, conceptual border of spaces of jurisdiction. Now, the idea of a state of exception is an old one. It appears in 18th century jurisprudence and so on. It's most famously articulated by the rather problematic Carl Schmitt in the 1920s. Problematic because Carl Schmitt was a very active Nazi and was Hitler's own professor of jurisprudence, which makes him rather unpopular as a dinner guest. Well, he died in 1981, so he would be. Notwithstanding his particular failings, Carl Schmitt's work has recently been extensively revisited because it is irritatingly compelling in some ways. And most specifically, it's been revived by Giorgio Agamben, relieved to say he's not a Nazi by any stretch of the imagination. He wrote this extraordinary book called Homo Sacer. Homo Sacer, by the way, has a relationship with headlessness. Homo Sacer is a Roman legal construction whereby an individual, if their crime was deemed bad enough, was called a sacred person. And that didn't mean a holy person, it meant someone who could be killed without punishment. They occupied a very particular external space from society under Roman law. Agamben picks up on Schmitt's construction of the state of exception because for Agamben, the state of exception is becoming a normal political practice. If you think about Guantanamo Bay, extraordinary rendition, and all these kinds of suspensions of the law, you begin to get the gist. Essentially, a state of exception is a legal suspension of law in the name of the law. So just as sovereign trust is suspending sovereignty, or using sovereignty to traduce sovereignty, so the state of exception traduces law through law. And if that sounds quite contradictory, it is. It's also an essential feature of all sovereign spaces throughout Western history. And it's a huge problem for political authorities. Just an aside, it became very much the fore in Britain a few years ago when part of Windsor Castle burnt down. And it became apparent, most of the British population didn't know this, that the Queen didn't pay any tax. And the reason for that is because she is sovereign. She defines the state of exception, technically, and therefore she doesn't pay any tax to herself as a sovereign authority. And there was a huge constitutional fuss, and eventually got sorted out with a bit of a fudge, whereby she pays a voluntary contribution. She still doesn't pay any tax. Anyway, that's kind of beside the point. But you can see why I put this up from the Agamben quote. The ordering of space that is constitutive of the sovereign nomos, the nomos being the territory of law, is therefore not only a taking of land, the determination of a juridical and territorial ordering, but above all, a taking of the outside, an exception, a definition of what is over there and not like here. And this boundary drawing is central to the functioning of offshore and Xenospace. For Agamben and for Schmidt before him, the state of exception was essentially a political legal act. The state, the sovereign state, imposed the state of exception because it was a sovereign authority. What's happened, however, with offshore, because of the capacity of money to escape and to create its own reality, is we effectively created a state of exception driven by bankers, accountants, lawyers, the people who have access to this xenospatial form that has emerged since the mid-1950s. And again, Agamben encapsulates some of the essential features of this in this quote. In its archetypal form, the state of exception is therefore the principle of every juridical localization, since only the state of exception opens the space in which the determination of a certain political order and a particular territory first becomes possible. As such, the state of exception itself is thus essentially unlocalizable, even if definite spatio-temporal limits can be assigned to it from time to time. Now, encapsulated in that rather dense quote is in part what's happened to state sovereignty over the past few decades. We used to believe very strongly in state sovereignty. It was an inviolable truth. One nation under God, all that kind of stuff. Gordon Brown is still obsessed with what he calls his red lines. Fiscal sovereignty is his number one red line issue that he will not debate, in spite of the fact, as we all know, state boundaries no longer contain economies. They don't contain law. They don't contain us. They certainly don't contain artists. And so we have transcended our temporary, spatio-temporal limits. And one of the ways we've done that is because of the state of exception articulated by money, Xenomoney in particular. So, coming back to goo, I'm going to wind up quite soon, I think. Bataille, as I said at the beginning, had an emancipatory idea for Acéphale, Headless. It was going to make the world better. Goo wanted to believe in this too, but he saw the key, decapitation being that of money, being the general equivalent. But what's actually happened in practice, if I'm right, is that offshore has essentially decapitated the general equivalent and taken it away. So it is offshore that's operating, and back to the Goo quote, beyond the principle of centralization and not hunkering within its limits. Both an acephalous multitext and a xenospatial sovereign praxis. Offshore is not illegal. It is illegal. It is outside of legal domain. And it presents us with a very significant political problem, a very significant legal problem, particularly at the current time when, as the ashes are being turned over, the role of offshore in the credit crunch, the subprime crisis, and so on, is becoming increasingly evident. One of the problems we have in trying to rein in the banks in the aftermath of the subprime and so on is precisely because so much of their activity is offshore. It's actually entered a different domain entirely. Offshore is a peculiar beast. It's really very strange. And a number of people, and I think Goldin+Senneby have the same kind of relationship with it, to it. I am both appalled by it, disgusted by it in many ways, but also rather admiring of it. It's very clever stuff. But it is nevertheless an amoral domain. If we look at the way sovereign trusts present their activities, then they do so in entirely neutral language. This is a land beyond morality. This is beyond a morality particularly associated with the state. It's also highly erotic. The imagery of offshore, this is sovereign trust again, it's very sexy. It's very much about skipping about on beaches with nubile young people and all that kind of stuff. It sells itself as this very erotic, sexy space. It's also, and this relates, I think, to headlessness quite importantly, excessive. Nobody needs offshore. If you can afford to use offshore, by definition, you don't need it. It is an excessive act, as is decapitation. You don't have to cut someone's head off to kill them. Decapitating someone is a deeply symbolic, excessive act. It is a symbol of excess. I would argue offshore has something of the same character. It's also exclusionary, and I mean that in two senses. It's exclusionary in the sense that it's exclusive. It's an exclusive club. They won't let me in. But it's also exclusionary in the sense that it generates a raft of social exclusions. And by that I don't just mean poverty at one end, though that's certainly an aspect of it. John Christensen, who appears in the Goldin+Senneby documentary, has argued very strongly that the presence of offshore in the world is denying development funds to the vast majority of the world population that need it most. It's also, more prosaically, robbing our own internal revenue services of various kinds of vast sums of money, which has an impact on our own societies, let alone anybody else's. But it also generates social exclusions in that people are allowing themselves to be dislocated in states. The most obvious people like Rupert Murdoch, who shift passports in order to buy various companies, but perhaps the most extreme are the perpetual tourists, the people who move around from place to place in order not to be anywhere long enough to incur taxation. And they have all their affairs rolled up in these various hybrid company structures. So it's a complex thing offshore, but is it headless? Now, I apologise for the image. It's entirely gratuitous. I just happen to like it. It's by 19th century American printmaker Thomas Nast, who was very active in the debate over post-bellum money after the Civil War in the United States. But it does say something perhaps important. I'm not sure offshore is headless. I haven't raised this with Goldin+Senneby yet. I will do it in the near future. I'm wondering whether it's headless or multi-headed, because it is too easy, and I think Gavin McFadden does this a little bit in his contribution to the documentary, to simply assume that this is some terribly out there, uncontrolled, unregulated, completely external space. And I know I've said some of these things too, but I don't believe it is. I think actually we can rein this thing in. But that raises a particular political problem, an economic problem. How do we put the head back on, in a sense? How do we rein this in? Now, that's more or less all I've got to say. I didn't want to come to too definite a conclusion for the simple reason that the project is ongoing and because I have no idea where it's going either. So I'm going to leave my comments there and take questions.